Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Strategic Planning from an Assessment Perspective, presented by Dr. Christine Austin and Jordan Denton. My name is Brianne, and thank you for joining us. We're excited to have you all here, and we are really looking forward to hearing from our presenters today. If you are new to our webinars, I'll quickly review our control panel for you. So over on the far left, you can control if you have audio through your computer or through your phone. And feel free to send us a message in the chat feature if you're having any technical difficulties, and we'll try and help out with that. And then you can use the Q&A feature at any time during the presentation to ask our presenters a question. We'll be monitoring that throughout and then share them at the end. And then if you do need to leave for any reason, you can either just close out of the window or click leave the webinar, which is found on the far right. We are recording this session today, so if you need a copy or know someone else who would be interested in watching it, we'll be sending that out along with the slides later this week. And finally, we do have a short survey that's going to pop up at the end, and your feedback really shapes what we do, so we would really appreciate if you could take a couple of minutes to complete it. And with that, I'll pass things over to Dr. Ray Van Dyke, who is our Senior Vice President here at Weave.
Thank you, Brianne, and welcome everyone. We're so delighted that we had quite a few of you who were obviously very interested in this important topic. And I think you're going to be very pleased with what you see here. These times certainly are times of unpredictability, and having some strategic planning in mind or having a process in place certainly will assist in getting through these times. So the plan for today is for us to talk to you about strategic planning from an assessment perspective. We have two excellent presenters, Christine Austin, who is Director of Assessment and Institutional Effectiveness at Arkansas Tech University, as well as being a Professor of Student Affairs Administration, has done just a tremendous job there at Arkansas Tech with their assessment program, and also is looking forward to having an upcoming reaffirmation with Higher Learning Commission, which of course is all kind of in unsteady grounds right now too. So I know she has a lot on her mind, and we really appreciate Christine taking the time to be here. And along with her, equally to provide some great advice and suggestions, is Jordan Denton, who is our Manager of Customer Engagement here at Weave. Before coming to Weave, she was actively engaged with assessment on the campus at Arkansas Tech also, and has a great deal that she's going to be able to share. Many of you probably, those of you who use our software have probably met Jordan at some point, at least through emails or chat. So anyway, we're ready for them to get started here, and we really look forward to it. Thank you all for coming, and I'll turn it over to Christine and Jordan.
Thanks so much for the introductions, Ray and Brianne, for your support in helping to make this webinar happen. So I will let Dr. Austin provide more details about herself and her journey in a few minutes, but a few additional words about Dr. Austin. So as Ray mentioned, my name is Jordan Denton, and I am the Manager of Customer Engagement here at Weave. But prior to joining Weave, I did work with Dr. Austin at Arkansas Tech. So I just want to say a few additional words in thanking her for giving my assessment career its start. I know I wouldn't be qualified to be in the position that I am in, helping many of our members here at Weave and contributing to the assessment community, if it had not been for her. So now that you have a brief knowledge about us, we really want to learn more about you all and who is in the room today. So we're going to launch two polls to start with, but the first is looking at what is your role on campus, or maybe if you're not on campus, you might select other. So we'll give everybody a few minutes to respond to this. While most of those votes are coming in, just so you can be thinking about the next poll, we really want to learn about how involved is everyone with the strategic plan at your institution. So we have almost all the votes. I'll try and give that just a few more seconds, but if you want to be thinking about what has your role been with the strategic plan at your institution. I'll give that about 5 more seconds. All right. So it looks like most 25% are assessment directors. We also have a lot of IE, IR directors, so maybe those combined roles. I'm glad to see faculty and staff as well as program and department chairs in here, administrators as well, and then others. All right. So again, that next poll, looking at your involvement in strategic planning. Maybe you're not involved at all, and that's why you're here, is to learn how you can contribute to your strategic plan if you're not. Maybe you're involved at the measurement and evaluation stage, so not at that initial planning phase as the strategic plan is being written or planned, but maybe once information, evidence, data is being gathered, maybe you're at that measurement stage, or maybe you do have involvement from start to finish. So throughout the entire strategic planning process. So from planning through that measurement and evaluation. Most are in, we still have a few more coming through. I like to try and give a minute so that everybody can get their answers submitted. All right. We still have some coming in, so we'll give it just a bit longer. All right, it looks like that's starting to slow down now. Okay. So almost half, 49%, are involved throughout the strategic planning process. And I really think that's the ideal position to be in. That's where we all want to be. But for the 20% who aren't involved at all, or the 30% that are involved at the measurement stage, that difference may be your position. You know, if you're faculty, staff, program chairs, maybe you're involved, maybe you're not. You might sit on a subcommittee. But if you're in that assessment, IE, IR role, and you're not involved at all, or you're involved at that measurement and evaluation stage, really want to look at that. So thank you for providing that information. We're going to give you a break from the polls for just a minute. And so look at, why are we doing and hosting this webinar specifically on strategic planning, but also specifically now? So over the past few months, based on conversations that we here at Weave have had, that Dr. Austin has had, that I've had with Weave members, but also with assessment colleagues and thought leaders in the field. So everyone we're really hearing from, strategic planning has been one of the 2 most popular topics during this time, the other being program review. And so looking at why is that? Giving I think the different office structures, the different use of times that people have been spending over the past few months, it seems as though people are really using this time to be intentional in looking at their processes. So maybe looking at what might need to be improved from last year or previous years, as well as using this time to thoroughly examine how to make changes that will best align with the needs and structures going forward during this time. So looking at this from the strategic planning process, whether you're making adjustments midway through a current plan, some might be nearing the end of a current plan and looking to make improvements for upcoming strategic planning. If you've learned along the way some adjustments you might need to make. Others may have just started a new plan and really taking into consideration where your institution is headed, what adjustments you might need to make, and either what still remains a high priority from your strategic plan, or looking at items on your strategic plan that may have become a higher priority during these times. So looking at that, I'm going to transition it over to Dr. Austin for a moment, and she's going to talk more about kind of why our present reality is bringing that strategic planning conversation to the surface as the top discussion.
Great. Thank you, Jordan. And I just want to say I'm very proud of you. Jordan was one of my students as well as an employee in my assessment office. And I really, really miss her. But I'm so pleased and proud to see the kind of work she's doing now. And really, she's the one who convinced me to do this webinar. I am typically used to doing presentations in front of audiences. I've done 3 of them at HLC now, but this is the first one that I've ever done without shoes on. So I'm really going to enjoy the difference, and hopefully we'll do a good job here. But really, when we were talking about why we were doing a strategic planning webinar and really looking at it from the point of view of an assessment director, it was because of the experience that she and I both had at Arkansas Tech, and really looking at what we and every other institution is going through right now is really important. We all pretty much had to pivot online in March, and everyone was scrambling to move their operations and their people into a safe place, and it was confusing. I know for a fact that it was anxiety provoking, because as an assessment director, I did a couple of surveys out to our folks to look at their transition to remote learning and operations. And I know for a fact that everybody was very stressed and very anxious. And when you're anxious and stressed, it doesn't bode well for what you're doing unless you have something to anchor you. And while institutions are, right now very busy creating those plans for the coming year, we're still in that unpredictability phase. We don't really quite know. We're trying to account for every possibility, and that is crazy making. So what are you going to do to make sure that you can move forward? Having a strategic plan is one of those pieces that can help to ground an institution. It's going to give it that guiding plan, that direction, and that daily stability that's going to keep us moving forward and continuing to meet our missions, which is the key purpose of institutions. So I know that humans are creatures of habit. Even though some of us like to fly by the seat of our pants, which I kind of feel like I'm doing just now, but colleges and universities cannot afford to fly by the seat of the pants. So the successful ones are the ones that are going to have those plans that are going to guide them going forward in the coming months and the years. Go ahead, Jordan.
Thanks, Dr. Austin. So looking at what we're going to cover today, I know some of this information was in the email. We've got some bullets up there for you. Dr. Austin will take you all through her journey in assessment and strategic planning here in just a minute. We're going to go over relevant definitions in assessment and strategic planning to emphasize the differences between the two, but also highlight the alignment and similarities between the two, and so that we're all using the same language today as well. We'll take a very brief look at the history of strategic planning, kind of where it started in its transition to higher ed. We feel it's important to highlight and acknowledge this information, but we're not going to spend much time on these slides as we really want to get to the bulk of the presentation. So some of the slides have more content on them than we would typically include for a presentation, but knowing these slides will be available to you afterwards, we want to make sure to include additional information so that it's helpful and useful for you even after today. We're going to go over some of the common uses of strategic planning in higher ed, looking at the role of assessment professionals, and really taking a look into seats at the table, which is kind of why we did that second poll. Looking at the integration and relationship between assessment and strategic planning, both the similarities between the two as well as how they complement each other, and how they integrate and really tell the story between the two. And so with all of that, let's get started and hear from Dr. Austin.
All right, so what I'm going to do today is really look at strategic planning and assessment from my position as an assessment director, and really what are the things that I sought out to learn about, the best practices, and maybe some recommendations or lessons from what I learned. And really what you already heard a little bit about me. I received my doctorate in 2007 after a nice long career actually as an administrator in student affairs. But when I came to Arkansas Tech, I started teaching in the student affairs department there. And I was tempted away to direct the Office of Assessment and Institutional Effectiveness. And even though I had taught assessment to graduate students and I performed assessment in my student affairs positions, I really started falling in love with it during that transition into the role of Director of Assessment. So much so that I've also become a member of the Peer Review Corps for HLC as well. So I have done a transplant and I now have assessment in my blood. But I've come to understand how integral assessment is to the smooth running of a university. And a lot of my work is really to gently persuade my colleagues that assessment is that guiding force under everything, and that everything is aligned. So just like most things, assessment is about establishing and maintaining relationships, and then linking and leveraging those commonalities and connections that you make between people and processes. And so I really want to share some of those things that I learned, and hopefully that'll give you something to take away. So in 2015, I started as the Director of Assessment. In the same year that ATU started a new strategic planning process. They started it prior to 2016, but they started putting together the groundwork for it. And because I was brand new, I don't know why, but I was not included on the planning committee. So I kind of got to watch it and contribute as the rest of the faculty and staff as a member of the community, and add in my 2 cents as the open forums occurred and people started to deliver the working papers that became the strategic plan in the end. In 2016, when that plan was finalized and approved, I sat down with my assessment specialist as well, and we really looked at the assessment, or looked at the strategic plan, and started marking all of those items that assessment was definitely going to play a part in. And really looking at where we could add value to the strategic planning process. Never knowing that in 2017, I was going to be asked to create the progress report on year 1 of strategic plan. So I got asked at that point in 2017 to assess the progress of the strategic plan that I had not actually been a part of the planning for. So like what I'm hearing a lot of people find is that they get pulled in at the end, and they get pulled in to assess the status and the progress that's going forward, which is not ideal. So I had an inkling that might be the case. So we were prepared for it, and we started doing some work around that. One of the first things that I started to do was to make sure that I would be at the table the next time. And some of those things are to start aligning the HLC components to the strategic plan goals, to show how assessment needs to be in there at the beginning. Accreditation is also part of my position. So that was an easy one, and really get that linkage started in people's minds, particularly those folks in upper administration who were making the decisions about who was going to be guiding the strategic plan forward. So really starting to make those links for them about accreditation and assessment, and tie it together. So the past 3 years, I have been doing those strategic plan updates. Every year, get all of the information from various divisions and offices, departments from across the campus, and compile those into a report on the progress and where we are with our strategic plan. It has sunk in, apparently, because I am now on the strategic planning committee, actually the guiding committee, one of the 3 members who are guiding the process for the next strategic plan. So being able to get in there, make those connections has really helped going forward, and I am super excited about that part. Next slide. All right, so one of the things we really want to make sure is that we're all on the same page, and this is something that I do a lot of times with different departments when I'm trying to make sure that we all have the same terminology that we're starting with, because if you're not using the same definitions, people get off on a different foot. So you really want to make sure everybody is clear about what we're looking at here. And mission statements, strategic planning, and assessment are those 3 definitions that I want to make sure everybody is on the same page with. So first of all, your mission statement, it really is demonstrating why the institution exists. It really tells you what this institution is all about and what it purports to do. So you have to have that common understanding of what the institution is all about. Strategic planning demonstrates that the institution is committed to that mission and has goals for deciding how they're going to achieve that mission. So that's your strategic planning, is really that plan on how you're going to meet those goals. And then assessment really does play a part in that, because it helps define those metrics that you're going to use to measure that achievement that you have planned to achieve. So they all have to work hand in hand. And it really, you cannot have one without the other. Next up. So a little bit about the history of strategic planning, and I'm going to be really brief here because we don't want a lesson in it. And this whole, as Jordan and I were working on it, we could do pretty much an entire day on this. So it was hard to pull stuff back, but it's important, I think, to know that strategic planning has its history in the military. And obviously you are looking at strategy and determining how you're going to go about making your plans happen. You're going to strategize, and that's a very typical military term. But it became the focus of corporations in roughly the mid-60s and 70s, and they started looking at how they were going to really hone in on what they were doing to make them successful. Some of you probably have studied a few of these names. Mintzberg, who really looked at what's good planning, what is the thing that prevents it from being successful, and really looking at planning in a way that make sure you don't confuse it with other things. And one of the things that he identified was that it's not predetermination. You're not trying to predict what's going to happen in the future. You cannot do that. No one can. I don't think any of us could have predicted the COVID-19 crisis. We knew that kind of thing was out there, but maybe not the extent to which we've had to deal with it. And also then, you don't want to detach your strategy from your operations. They need to go hand in hand. And that's why this is important to talk about, that assessment and strategic planning really play a part, intertwined together. Finally, SENG is a good one. I love knowing that we want to create that culture where everybody feels that they can take a part, and that risk-taking, which when you're starting to look at direction, it really is risk-taking. So we want to make sure that that is encouraged across the campus. Next slide. This is a real quick, and I'm just going to look at very, very shortly. There are a lot of different types of strategic planning. These are just two of them: the rational comprehensive, and then the successive limited. And really, they've got nicknames, basically roots and branches. So when you're looking at the roots, what you're looking at is a holistic picture of the institution, really looking at doing some values clarification activities, trying to figure out what your institution is all about to make sure that you're meeting every need, and that those ends are the things you start with. What is it you want to end up with? And then look at what kinds of means you can get to reach them. Looking at branches, that one is more picking it apart and not doing it in a large holistic manner, but really looking at a selection of various areas and doing that planning in that way. It's really more of the learning by doing, rather than using theory to try and make that holistic picture. Next slide.
All right, thanks. So before we look at the next slide, we want to pause and ask a poll here, looking at what obstacles have you encountered around strategic planning at your institution? This one is multiple choice. There may have been multiple obstacles. If you haven't had any obstacles, you felt like everything ran smoothly, went ideally, gone as expected, there is an option that says everything is rainbows and unicorns covered in glitter. So that means everything was good to go. You felt like there weren't any obstacles. So one of the obstacles, as we saw from one of the initial polls, looking at what is your involvement in strategic planning, is I don't have a seat at the table. Regardless, again, if your position is assessment, i.e. IR director, whether your program chair, faculty, staff, if you feel like you should have had a role at the table or a seat at the table and you didn't, maybe you felt like that was an obstacle. And when we say at the table, again, that is the planning phase when the institution is being written. So as Dr. Austin mentioned, there may be open forums for faculty and staff. Maybe that is your way to contribute and be involved. But again, if you weren't at the table in the planning phase and you feel like your role is critical to that. Our strategic plan isn't measurable. So again, if you're looking at strategic planning, and what do we want to accomplish? What is our vision? maybe the thought of how are we going to measure that? How are we going to show and demonstrate that we are, that we're meeting that we're achieving what we've set for ourselves? Maybe assessment wasn't thought about, so it's not measurable. You have a strategic plan, but no way to look at that assessment component for it. Our strategic plan isn't representative of our entire institution. So if there is a program office or a department that feels like they do not have anything to contribute, or they can't contribute to their strategic plan, what they do, the purpose they serve for the institution isn't taken into consideration for the strategic plan, maybe you feel like it's not representative. Our strategic plan is not a living document. So some of the things that I've heard again in the assessment community and those that I have worked with over the summer is that the strategic plan is written and then it's put somewhere that technically people can get to, but there's no discussion around it. It's not an active document. There's not interaction, whether that's, if your strategic plan has a specific web page for your institution so that people can easily access it, look at that anytime. And then it doesn't guide our decision making. So again, you've written that strategic plan. It's not a living document, and it's not, again, informing those actions and those decisions being made. So it looks like most people have voted. So I'm going to end the polling and share those results with you. So again, this was multiple choice. A few of you, everything seems to be going great, and that's fantastic. We are glad to hear it. I'll say on the questions, if you have thoughts, comments, questions, and maybe you want to ask or share, but you don't necessarily want to post it live so that all participants and attendees can see it, in the chat box, there is a way to send it only to us as panelists, so feel free to do that. Again, so if you have questions that you want asked, but maybe you don't want your name attached to it, that's one way to do that. Or if everything is going great for you, if you have things that you want to share with the group, while Dr. Austin and I are presenting this webinar today, we really want it to be open dialogue and conversation across the assessment and higher ed community in general. So feel free to do that as well. But the most difficult one seems to be that the strategic plan doesn't guide decision making, followed by people not having a seat at the table. Again, the strategic plan not being measurable, it not being a living document, and it not representing the entire institution. All right. Thank you all for providing that information, and I am going to advance to the next slide and turn it back over to Dr. Austin for a minute.
Great. So one of the last pieces in the history that I was looking at was George Keller, who really started to pull strategic planning more into the higher ed realm. And this was in basically the 90s, I believe. And he identified 10 things that higher education strategic planning is not. And I think that's always a good way to look at it. This is what it should not be. And it shouldn't be the production of a blueprint, because you're not going to be stuck with that same house plan forever. Your house is going to change. It shouldn't be a set of platitudes that just our students will rise to whatever heights. That's platitudes. We don't want it to be something like that. We don't want it to be the personal vision of the Board of Trustees. This is a living document that should guide the work of the folks in the institution who are doing the day-to-day stuff. It shouldn't be a collection of departmental plans that is compiled and edited, because we have so many different departments. We have many different colleges in some cases, and they all have different directions. If you've got a huge collection like that, there is no guiding direction here. You've got a whole bunch of different priorities going on. It shouldn't be done by planners. Strategic plans should be done by the people who are living and working and implementing that plan. So while a lot of places I know do get assistance from outside planners, that should just be assistance in process, not in creating that actual plan. It shouldn't be a substitution of numbers for those important tangibles. You really want to not just collect numbers, you really want to have those things that you are trying to create, that direction that you're trying to reach. It shouldn't be a form of surrender to market conditions and trends. If your institution has a mission that guides it, and it's particularly liberal arts, and sometimes that might not be the thing that everybody wants to push forward, but you know why you're doing it. You have a purpose. Your mission is to provide that well-rounded education. Don't surrender to getting on the latest bandwagon of getting that latest tech degree or something. If that's not what your direction is, you shouldn't go that direction. It is not something that can be done on an annual retreat. Strategic planning takes a good bit of time, and I'll be talking about that a little bit more in a second, but you can't do it in a few hours. You really can't. It is not a way to eliminate risks, and it shouldn't be. You want people to be able to take risks and make those choices that could end in failure, but on the other hand, they could really take off for your institution. You want people to feel comfortable failing. That's something that I think we all have a hard time doing, because failure is looked at as something bad, when in all likelihood it's falling forward. If you're not failing, you're not moving somewhere. You're stuck in status. And then finally, it's not an attempt to read tea leaves and outwit the future. We're never going to be able to do that, as we all very, very clearly know now. Next one, Jordan.
All right. So before we move to the next one, now I want to pause and share just some things that have been coming in the chat. So someone mentioned that a challenge that they wanted to add is a challenge of having leadership that may not fully understand the process application of successfully generating a strategic plan, whether that's inclusive of all, making sure it's accessible, any of those. And, you know, their strategic plan ends up being larger than is doable maybe in the time frame that was set for that strategic plan. So we'll cover that in a little bit as well. I just wanted to share in case any others can relate to that. So we want to do a poll looking at covering and tying into that exact comment of how has strategic planning been used at your institution. All right, so I'm going to launch that poll, and you'll notice that first one is exactly that, to signal a change in leadership. You do it for accreditation requirements, whether that's your only reason or your main reason. So we'll talk about assessment, accreditation, strategic planning, how it all ties together in a minute. But just as we don't want to do assessment for the sole purpose of accreditation, we don't want to generate a strategic plan and put that time and effort in it for the purpose of accreditation as well. To really, again, get that involvement from all of your programs, offices, and departments to represent the entire institution. It needs to be something that is representative of everyone, and having that support that, yes, as an institution, this is where we want to go. This is what we want to achieve. So having that support from everyone. To plan ongoing university activities and direction. So again, does your strategic plan guide your decision making and where you're headed? And setting priorities for use by budgeting or advancement efforts. So still got a few trickling, and I'll give that just about 10 more seconds or so. All right, I'm gonna end the poll and share those results with you. So most have said, and this one was multiple choice as well, it's used to plan ongoing university activities and direction. Again, it's ideally, you know, one of the reasons and one of the places where we want to be at. But for some, the purpose of complying with accreditation requirements is one of those areas we really want to address and grow upon and kind of move away from. Yes, accreditation is a reason, but it shouldn't be the reason. And we'll talk about those in just a minute too. Signaling a change in leadership is common as well, and setting those priorities. All right. So the next slide is looking at the reasons, and that's why I wanted to do the poll before we shared this slide, is we didn't want it to influence your responses. All right, so looking at some of the reasons, kind of the just because ones, and we have two of the common responses of it being for accreditation, starting a new one because the old one, we had finished and closed the loop on that one, and change in leadership. While these are important to pay attention to, and they certainly have a role and play a part in strategic planning, none of these should be the primary reason. They all have a valid point, but they shouldn't be the main point. So an institution should have a strong strategic plan for accreditation. Reviewers will look at your strategic plan, but their focus is really more on what have you done around your strategic plan, and more importantly, how have you shown, and really are you showing how you're making progress on it? But again, it shouldn't be the driving force. And yes, a new leader typically wants to put their mark on an institution, but it should be a strategic plan for the institution, not a strategic plan for the leadership. And if it's being done correctly in that planning phase, all of these reasons should coincide and fall in place. So these would be good secondary reasons, but your long-term vision should really be the focus. So looking at those more meaningful reasons, again, setting that long-term direction, those university priorities, such as activities and direction, identifying and targeting that market that your institution serves. Each institution has its own unique purpose, its own population it wants to serve. That's why we all have mission and vision statements. To the market holders, your community, your guide everything else that you're doing, again, around assessment. So we'll look at how those integrate together in just a minute. But giving the institution as a whole a purpose and showing everyone the direction where it's going. What do we stand for as an institution? How do we want to serve the community, both local, state, and internationally as well? Right. So having reviewed this information, Dr. Austin is going to talk kind of about some of her initial reflections. So all that we've covered so far, and how did that tie back into her experience?
Right. Well, one of the things that when you're looking at a strategic plan, and this is what we're starting to do now as we move into the next one where I finally do have that seat at the table, is really looking at what the institution's purpose is, or what it's, why is it in existence? What's it here for? Really looking at that, and then getting a large, a large variety of perceptions and opinions across the campus, and really trying to use this whole thing as that guiding direction or that unifying purpose for the institution as well. Really looking at what the institution offers and why is it special? What is it that we do that no other institution really does? That's what you want to look at and really highlight. So you really want to do that deep dive into what it is you're all about at your particular institution. And then who are the stakeholders, and what does each one of them get from these offerings that we provide here? Stakeholders are broad. We've got a lot of stakeholders at Arkansas Tech, from the state, from the legislature, from alumni, from board members, from the community. Not to mention, I haven't even gotten on to the internal stakeholders at the institution. So we're looking at who we provide all of these academic offerings for, and really how do we make sure that we are meeting those needs, if that's what we intend to do, that we are offering things that are going to apply to all of the people that we need to gain their interest and their approval. And then how do they all interact between each other? What is that interaction? Really looking at all of those pieces. Once again, it's going back to that holistic root view of the strategic planning process. Next one.
And I'll just say there are so many great questions, comments coming in the chat. So we'll get to those at the end. I just wanted to acknowledge the conversations that are happening and appreciate everyone's involvement and activity during this webinar. So going back to that seats at the table, who is involved? When thinking about who has a seat at the table, really around, again, that actual planning phase, not just who has been given the opportunity at some point or another to contribute or give feedback. When deciding who that's going to be, ideally you want to think about who is telling your story, both as an institution to others, but also who will be helping to tell the story of your strategic plan as it's ongoing, once it's been completed and you're sharing your successes, talking about where you started, how you've grown during the duration of your strategic plan, and still where you want to go next. So when you look at who is telling and sharing this information, whether that's to potential students, so maybe your current students, to employers of your students, so when your students graduate and they go and get a job and they're telling about their experience at your institution to their employer, to those in the community, talking to alumni, donors back to advancement in budgeting, etc. Who are your advocates and your ambassadors? And whoever it is that is telling your story, and whoever is hearing your story, a sample from those populations, those stakeholders, they should have a seat at the table. And how do you give everyone a seat at the table? Not everyone's going to have a seat at the table. Maybe you have committees for your strategic plan, and then there's subcommittees for those. So again, giving the faculty and staff, students and alumni and board members the opportunity to serve on those subcommittees. Again, going back to open forums to gather that feedback and input, doing white papers. Do you have an open feedback submission process? So during this planning process, is there a way for people to give that feedback, whether it's a form on your website, it's an email they're supposed to contact? Do they know how to give that input?
So I've been looking at the questions too while Jordan's been doing her part, and the questions are fantastic, and I want to make sure we get to them. So I'm kind of going to gloss over this, but suffice it to say, this is a fantastic quote from an in just a second.
So we've talked about strategic and assessment together throughout this entire presentation. So while strategic planning guides the institution and what they're doing, an assessment guides more of your programs, your offices, departments. Really, they both guide each other. So previous assessment, that should be taken into consideration when writing your strategic plan. And in turn, then that strategic plan should have a part and a place in your assessment. What is it that your programs, offices, and departments are focusing on as it relates to your strategic plan, and in turn, what are they assessing? So if you're looking at the assessment IE role, what you are already doing in your assessment role, when you're working with those programs, offices, and departments, looking at their mission and goals and outcomes, as well as their measures, collecting that data, showing how what they are doing contributes back to those accreditation standards, whether national or programmatic, looking at how that ties back to gen ed outcomes. If you have institutional level outcomes or institutional priorities, maybe you have core values, all that you're doing in assessment, that aligns with how it works for strategic planning as well. So when you're having those conversations, if you don't have a seat at the table, getting to how can you contribute to the strategic plan if you're not in that planning phase, when you're still meeting with those people, faculty, staff, program chairs, department heads, deans, whatever that may be, and you're working with them on that yearly assessment component, working on their program review, helping them with their programmatic accreditation, that strategic plan should also be part of that conversation. If you're doing all of that assessment without talking about the strategic plan, that's a missing component of what they're doing and what they are supposed to be tying back to.
So really what we're looking at is strategic planning and assessment, and they're really part and parcel of the same thing. They start both with a mission focus. That mission should help an institution or a unit, either one of them, to define itself and to share with others who they are and who they serve, what they do, and how they will do it. So it really does start with the mission on both ends. A campus that is aware of its mission can build those habits that are going to exemplify the achievement of that mission. So if you can build that culture of continuous improvement, you're going to be able to demonstrate that improvement, that achievement through both the strategic planning and the assessment processes. And they are tied together, as Jordan was mentioning beforehand, so that can become an expected part of daily operations if they are working together. So once you've got that campus with a culture of continuous improvement, and I know it sounds, I'm making it sound really glib and easy. This is super hard. This is the hardest part of getting a campus all working together and aligning all of the parts of strategic planning and assessment. We could go on and on. Budgeting would be another one, which we couldn't add for a good reason, because this is already getting really long. But we really want to try and get that campus with a culture of continuous improvement integrated between planning and assessment, because you need to have that expertise. You need the expertise to assist in the planning and making sure that that plan is being achieved, but being achieved by all of the different assessment opportunities and activities that are taking place across the campus, that you have those ongoing expectations and practices that are going to help to get the plans achieved. So you're going to have different plans that need to be guided by the one plan of strategic planning. You're going to have academic planning, you're going to have resource planning, you're going to have facilities planning. All of those are ongoing practices that will be informed by having one strategic plan for the institution. And they also help to make it everybody's business to improve the process by creating those expectations for planning and assessment and job performance. Now, I noticed in the questions that someone was looking at the assessment becoming an evaluation, and that is not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is everyone realizing that they play a part in the improvement of the institution, not that the plans or the assessment is being used to evaluate them, but that they feel accountability, or they feel responsibility for making sure that the institution achieves those goals that it set forward in its strategic plan. The next 2 points, you really want to make sure that you're including that wide body of constituencies across the campus. That is what is going to build your organizational culture. We all want to be collegial institutions, because you want those opportunities for everyone to have the opportunity to contribute. And that kind of participation takes time. So you want to make sure that you're allowing adequate time for that kind of planning and assessment. You're really looking for plans that are going to be viable for anywhere from 5 to 10 years. It is a worthwhile investment to make sure that they're not so prescriptive that they run out of, you finish them up really quickly, but you want them to guide the direction you go, not to give you an exact roadmap. That's what you're going to do through your assessment. The final 3 points there are really looking at visibility and making sure that everyone can widely see the plan, see its updates, even more importantly, and see where all of the linkages are happening, making sure that your strategic plans updates are linked to assessment so that you know how everything is working, making sure that it's linked to budgetary decisions so you see where the priorities of the institution are. None of this should be a secret. Assessment results really ought to be widely shared across the campus and thoroughly discussed, because if you don't, you're not going to be able to lead to those substantive improvements to student learning. So it's got to be openly and widely discussed. And then linking all of this information to budgeting is just one more way of demonstrating and monitoring those priorities of the institution. So you want to be able to show that you are backing up the decisions that are being made by data. You want data-backed decisions, not data-driven, but data-backed, so that you can show how the assessment material that you are receiving is supporting the decisions that are being made, and that it's all communicated often and widely, so it's not sitting on the shelf. We definitely do not want a plan that just sits on the shelf. All right, so one of the ways that someone asked how I got my seat at the table here, part of it is, as I said, because part of my responsibilities were accreditation. So one of the things that it's very easy to do when you're looking at a reaccreditation is to get the institution looking back at their mission. It helps to keep the institution focused on mission, and you want to be able to do that all the time, not just prior to an accreditation. But strategic plans can do some double duty. So one of the other things that I did to get folks to realize that they needed to have assessment on board from the beginning was to align those goals of our strategic plan, those goals and the action items that were affiliated with them, to individual accreditation standards, really looking at that exercise that we did when we first got that strategic plan back, and finding those points that really were part of assessment. And a lot of those were under the guise of program review, making sure that we were reviewing all of our programs on a timely basis, that kind of thing, for currency, relevancy. That was all stuff that we were going to be doing in the course of assessment work anyway. So being able to link those to the accreditation standards and back to the strategic plan, and really show how everything was linked and aligned, was really valuable as an exercise for the institution at large and for administration as well. The other piece that I did was to identify those items that we wanted to track for ongoing trend evidence for use in our accreditation. So really helping the campus realize what kinds of items they needed to be watching for, and tracking and collecting as evidence. Making sure that they understood that we needed to collect actual evidence of how we were performing. And then it really helps to keep enculturating that continuous improvement in the institution. The other piece that you can use a strategic plan for is to help identify a quality initiative project. Most accrediting bodies will require that institutions do a QIP at some point prior to their reaccreditation. And that strategic plan is really useful in deciding on what that project is going to be.
All right, thanks, Dr. Austin. So we've got a few more points in wrapping this up and looking at the institutional story, and we'll talk about what it makes up and how to create a successful plan for your strategic plan, taking away personal observations. So looking at the institutional story, each one of these areas, so strategic planning, general education, that yearly assessment, program review, accreditation, each of these areas contributes to and builds on all of the others. They're all interlocking and they help tell your story, so they should all be integrated. And just as each chapter in a book is necessary, so if you're wondering why they're numbered by chapters, simulating a book, so chapters in a book. If you took out a chapter of any book, while you might still be able to piece some of the information in it together, whether you took out some in the beginning or the middle or the end, it would take more work to do so. And there would be sometimes or some items that were never explained or weren't fully explained if you didn't have all of those chapters. So you might know the end result of what happened, but you wouldn't have all the details of how it happened or why it happened. And this goes the same for telling your institutional story. So all of the areas must be taken into consideration and integrated into one another when you're telling that story, when you're talking about your institution, in order to provide that comprehensive picture and to tell your full story, to tell your best story.
So we're kind of getting to the end here, and I know that there's so many more questions and so many more things we could do, but I really want to make sure that these points are really driven home, that strategic planning, those successful plans, are the ones that are, once again, mission driven, that you're really looking at how do you meet your mission and what do you want to do to meet that mission. So you're really making sure that everything you do goes back to that mission. And that holds true for assessment as it does for strategic planning. You want to make sure that you're involving everybody that you possibly can, and particularly you want to make sure you're involving the faculty and staff on your campus. So on this one, I said solicit and implement, not solicit/implement, and there's a reason for that. You want to solicit that feedback, but you also want to make sure that you incorporate and use that feedback. You don't get a lot of good feedback going forward from your faculty and staff if you don't incorporate what it is that they want you to think about. So, you know, regardless of whether or not it's going to be all wonderful information, you want to make sure that you are addressing that feedback, and when you can, incorporating it into both your strategic planning and your assessment plans. The next piece is that it's infused throughout the institution, that strategic plan guides everything. It's not just for academics. It's not just for the business and administration area. Your strategic plan should focus or guide the work throughout the institution. Student affairs work is guided by strategic plan. The resources and facilities, all of those pieces really should be guided by the strategic plan, and it's all throughout the institution. You need to make sure that you are reviewing and updating the campus yearly on the strategic plan and its progress, and really revisiting it with the entire campus on a yearly basis. This shouldn't be a document that you create and then put down when, you know, show everybody once it's all done. It needs to be part of the yearly action of the institution. It should be updated if it's not meeting the needs you need, or if something has been worked to death. You should be able to change the focus, just like you would with a successful assessment plan. If you're not seeing a problem in that area, find the places where you need to address things more. Don't just rely on, this is the plan, this is what we have to stick to. They should be flexible enough to adapt to the situations that you're facing at hand, the environment that you're facing. Review them and update them yearly and get that feedback from the campus. And then finally, the progress that you have needs to be supported by evidence. You want to be able to show numbers. You want to be able to show trends. You want to be able to show the data that you are gathering to show the progress on your plan. That is just successful assessment as it is successful strategic planning. So all of those pieces go into creating successful strategic plans. They go into creating successful assessment. And that's another way to pull them all together. So just some final observations that I've had as I've been working in assessment for the last few years. It's really a two-way relationship. And one of the things that I've gotten to be successful with, and as well as making those relationships with all of the different parties who've been involved. And that's definitely key, is making those relationships. But it's a two-way process. You've got to have a strategic plan that informs the direction of your assessment plans. And you've got to have assessment data that will inform your strategic planning process and its progress. So they really work together. And that's one of those key areas that go a long way to helping administrators realize that they play together. This is the same sandbox. We all need to be helping each other. Everything is aligned, and it should all be integrated as well across the campus. One of the other things that I've noticed is that strategic planning sometimes elicits the same phrases that I hear when I talk to departments about assessment. I get resistance to change. Nobody wants to make a change. It's easier to keep things the way they are, but that doesn't move anything forward. It doesn't make progress for strategic planning, and it doesn't make for continuous improvement in your assessment process either. So I also know that there's a lot of fear of making mistakes. For those of you who are assessment directors out there, you know that a lot of getting people to do assessment is making them aware that there's no such thing as making a mistake. You need to try it, you need to do it. You're never going to get anywhere if you're staying in the same place. Goal displacements, priorities are going to shift, and that's going to be just the nature of the game. As long as you're doing continuous improvement, you're going to be moving from one priority or a goal to the next. So something that might be more important to one party is probably going to take the backseat in another occasion. So you just have to have that voice and be able to look at deciding those priorities, trying to get up there and make sure that your goals and your priorities are being met at some point, either during the current strategic planning process or in the future process. And then realizing that assessment and strategic planning is not just for top administration. It really guides the work that we do throughout the institution. That the people who own those decisions are the ones who are making the difference and making the changes and the improvements to student learning. And that's what everything is all about. Everybody has a stake in the improvement of the institution. It's not just top administration, and making sure that they're aware of it as much as the faculty and staff are aware that they play a part in that continuous improvement is really important. The other things that I've learned are that there are so many different processes going on a campus that really align to assessment, and that making those connections is really an assessment skill. So you are one of the people on campus who knows what's going on in every single area across the campus, and part of getting successful is making those connections for people and having them understand what they're doing is also being done in another area, and that in order to be more efficient, more effective, and use resources in the best way, it's really great to align with other areas or other departments who are doing that same thing and really work together. It gets everybody rowing the boat in the same direction, and that is what's going to make both your strategic plan and your assessment plans successful. So making sure that everybody is playing in the same direction, and that's an assessment skill. And then lastly, that plans are just guidelines. They're living documents. They really need to be flexible, and you really need to be able to adapt them to the situation or the environment at hand. You really cannot work with a plan that is so static that it doesn't allow you to change when some kind of situation occurs that really requires it. So making sure that you understand that they are not, they're not set in stone, and making sure that they are used as guidelines. That requires, once again, back at the beginning, a lot of work in the planning stages. So all of those things can contribute to creating successful plans. The biggest one is building those relationships throughout and making those alignments clear for everybody across the campus.
Thank you so much, Dr. Austin. So again, slides are going to be shared. We do have a resource slide if you want to refer back to any of those. We've been trying to answer questions and integrating and incorporating, just because the questions or comments really tied into what we were already presenting on. So we try to integrate those, but any questions that we have not addressed already in the presentation, we will share with the recording that will be sent via email. So if we didn't get to your question, we promise that we will. I know we're a few minutes over, so thank you to everyone that has stayed with us, even beyond. It was a lot of information to cover. This was even doing a brief history and cutting some information out, but again, we wanted to make sure to cover strategic planning in its entirety, as it does cover and incorporate a lot of components. So with that being said, I am going to, again, thank Dr. Austin for joining me in this presentation and being willing to share her experience, her insights with all of you. We do hope that it was helpful. And I'm going to turn it back over to Brianne. Thanks again, everyone.
As Brianne is taking over this, the slides, I'll also say a very big thank you to Christine and Jordan for doing a terrific job. Lots of great information. It's always nice when you have so much to share, and the questions, as Jordan says, we will make sure that we get some responses to you, but thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you to our presenters, and thank you to everyone. Don't forget that we will have a survey popping up at the end. It'll launch in SurveyMonkey, so we'd appreciate if you took a couple minutes to complete that. And then we will be sending out an email with the recording and the slides, as well as the responses to the questions that were submitted. And then please visit our Knowledge Center, which has more free resources, such as guides for download, case studies, and previous webinars. And that's where you'll also find any future webinars posted. So we hope to see you again soon.